So, as a reminder to everybody, there's a prophecy, and we find it in a couple of different places, but the one that people seem to quote the most is in Isaiah chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, and it's a prophecy against Damascus, which is, of course, the capital of Syria. See, Damascus will no longer be a city, but will become a heap of ruins. So what this is the prophecy that's never been fulfilled. So we know that at some point in time it will be fulfilled. And I know that in listening to Amir and others, they've kind of figured or feel that the destruction of Damascus, Syria, could be the next big thing on the prophetic time clock. We'll just have to wait and see on that. So at some point in time, and it seems likely that that when that occurs, not if but when, that Damascus is destroyed. We don't know how it's going to happen. What it's going to be, who knows? Could be anything. Could be a nuclear event, I suppose, although it doesn't seem too likely. But whatever it is, it's going to render it uninhabitable. And a lot of folks think that this will be very, very close to the Gog-Magog war that we've talked a little bit about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So probably it's noteworthy that all this is happening. There's been a lot of military activity in Syria. And I want to go over a couple of things in a moment just to kind of bring us up to speed. But things are happening over there at a breakneck pace. I was listening to a fellow the other day who is somewhat of an authority on this whole Iranian situation, and he fully expects that Israel and Iran could go to war as early as the spring of next year. That Israel is it's what we call a one-bomb nation. And they just can't afford to allow Iran, or Israel's a one-bomb nation, they can't afford for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. So a lot of interesting things going on there. So, and
I don't think you were at our table, but the church, Pastor Jay and Liz are supposed to lead a trip to Israel in April.
Yeah, we'll see. It's hard to tell whether that's going to be doable or not. Is that this coming April?
April 15th.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Tax day.
Yeah, they had their grandbaby. They're there now.
No, they're back.
Oh, they're back.
They just got back.
That's all this tonight. Okay, just a couple of quick articles. The first one, and this is just demonstrates how perverted we're becoming, our country's becoming. And we've all heard about this Build Back Better plan that I think is in a little bit of trouble. I don't think it's going to go through, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. It's just a vote, just a senator or two away from being passed. And, not the impact that it'll have on the economy in terms of inflation will be overwhelming. But there's a lot of provisions and a lot of components to the plan, including this is something that you might be interested in, Maria, but it says that President Biden's multi-trillion-dollar Build Back Better is garnering pushback from religious groups as it becomes clear that the benefits slated to help preschool children come with strings attached. In order to access the federal funding, the daycare programs must include LGBT indoctrination. That's built into the bill. And this is 3- and 4-year-old kids. And so the White House's, quote, fact sheet claims that the program will provide universal preschool. And, of course, there's more to this whole universal preschool thing that meets the eye. I mean, they want to indoctrinate every child. They want a cradle to grave socialist system. So,
What?
Kids don't have a prayer unless they're brought up in, a Christian home. The things that they're going to be learning, the things that they're going to think are normal.
Right. Oh, right.
So
right.
auto-kick. mean,
Yeah.
I feel so bad for these kids. So
It's terrible. President Biden's plan offers access to free preschool for all 3 to 4-year-old children, providing parents access to high quality programs in their setting of the setting of their choice, from schools to child care provisions and community-based organizations to Head Start. Critics of the bill say that faith-based facilities that affirm biblical beliefs on marriage and gender should not be able to participate because they do not hold to LGBT ideology. A report in the New York Times noted that faith-based educational institutions representing more than half of child care programs in the U.S. may not qualify as the bill contains a, quote, non-discrimination provision. According to the Times, the bill's provisions would force them to choose between participating in the child care initiative and continuing to teach religious content, convene all boys and girls programs, or give preferences in hiring or admissions to people of their religion. Under the current legislation, Christian, Catholic, and Jewish child care centers are not bound by any federal non-discrimination laws, but the new legislation changes this. The bill will provide approximately $400 billion to help the state build a universal kindergarten and affordable child care program in 6 years. This is intended to ensure that the majority of families, 4-person households with incomes up to $300,000, spend less than 7% of their income on child care. Families who earn less than 75% of the state's median income will pay nothing. It's a fellow by the name of Zach Pruitt said the bill contains funding provisions in new grant programs that are likely to exclude many faith-based child care providers while cutting funding to existing child care programs currently being utilized by many faith-based providers. This, he said, jeopardizes the freedom of parents to send their children to child care programs that align with their religious beliefs. I mean, they're coming after the church. They're coming after us, full force. Right. Yeah. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops said the bill's provisions are a departure from the approach in existing federal programs and present new and troubling compliance obligations. So more to come on that. We just got to pray that bill, which is a lot more than just, like I say, throwing money away, but it contains a lot of things that are not good for us. And just further.
My brother is in Minnesota and he's learning disabled. And he got a letter that they're going to be cutting funding probably. These are the people that need it the most.
I know. Oh.
Yeah, terrible.
Because of that bill.
Oh, really? Yeah. So, as the last I heard, it's, I think Joe Manson is hopefully going to prevent it from happening. Yeah, he's the, So, another article, getting back to Israel. Just, I think it's important as we go through the study of Israel to understand that as we get closer and closer and closer to the return of Jesus Christ, that the state of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, Temple Mount are going to become the key issues that that the world's going to have to confront. And we'll look at a couple of scriptures, I think, that point that out. But anti-Semitism is rising just exponentially right now. It's always been an issue, but now it just seems to be getting worse and worse. So here's an article entitled, "Embattled Politician Says International Pressure Could Force Israel to Walk Back Policies on Jerusalem, Slams Practice of Holding Terrorists." Okay, so let me just read this. Palestinian Authority Chair Mahmoud Abbas. And when it comes to that guy, the head of the Palestinian Authority, you kind of take what he says with a grain of salt. He has no power. He is not popular, and his days are numbered in terms of how long he's going to be around. But he warned the Jewish state that he is gearing up to take major diplomatic action against Israel during a fiery media conference. Alongside Tunisian President Said on Wednesday. He said, quote, "We will never agree to the continuation of Israeli occupation and apartheid on our country and our people," Abbas said. Total, complete lies. I mean, this is what the Palestinian does, is they spew propaganda like there's no tomorrow. And the idea that that Israel is, quote, occupied. It is occupied, but it's not occupied by Jews. It's occupied by others. And Israel's perfectly okay with that. But from the Palestinian perspective, it's occupied as long as there's one Jew in the territory. And interestingly, and I don't know if I mentioned this last week or not, but if you look at any Palestinian map, it does not mention Israel at all. It doesn't exist. It's all part of the Arab world. So they have no intent whatsoever in establishing a two-state solution. Their goal is to wipe Israel off the face of the map, which is what God told us was going to happen as we get closer to the last days. We will never accept the attacks on our identity, character, and residence of East Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the Temple Mount, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we will never agree to the continuation of the killings, the demolition of houses, the abuse of our prisoners, the holding of the bodies of our martyrs, and the continuation on the siege of the Gaza Strip. So this is just full of lies and deception. First of all, they're claiming that the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Temple Mount belongs to them. It doesn't. It's the site of the first and second Jewish temples. And clearly God has given it to the Jewish people, but it's becoming a real bone of contention. It has been for a long time. It's only going to get worse. The embattled Palestinian politician who was wildly unpopular among his constituents and has faced repeated protests and calls to resign did not mention the wave of violent attacks on Jews in Jerusalem in recent weeks. So attacks and so forth on Jews in Jerusalem and Israel have escalated, I think, in the last several months. To illustrate what he called Israel's callous attitude toward Palestinians, Abbas spoke about Israel's practice of holding the bodies of terror attack perpetrators for indefinite amounts of time. They're the ones that do that, and the bodies that they're talking about and those that are incarcerated are terrorists, plain and simple. That's what it is. Can you imagine in your mind that Israel holds hundreds of bodies of martyrs for no purpose but to punish the martyrs' families? You know that the Palestinian Authority, if a terrorist blows up a bus, for example, and is killed, they pay the family money. It's kind of like a reward for doing it. Abbas' choice of words referring to terrorists who had violently attacked and killed Israelis as martyrs is notable. The Palestinian Authority, Abbas said, would soon take unilateral actions at an international action to force Israel to walk back its current policies. And I think what's significant there is that you got the whole world. So last week we talked about the United Nations, the 119 nations that are standing behind the Palestinian Authority and calling Jerusalem an Arab capital, the Arab capital, when in fact it clearly belongs to the Jewish people. And just quickly, and we've read this scripture a bunch of times. To some of us it's kind of new, but in the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, is a prophecy, very important, and one that we're seeing clearly being played out today. Zechariah 12, beginning in verse 1. a prophecy, the word of the Lord concerning Israel. The Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundations of the earth, and who forms the human spirit within a person declares. So the creator of everything declares. This is a thus saith the Lord. If you're reading in other translations, he goes on to say, and it's interesting, notice the personal pronoun I. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. Now, when it says besieged, that's kind of like a siege, and it's going to be on surrounding all of Israel and Jerusalem. This is kind of a reference to Armageddon, when all of the armies of the world are going to gather together to attack and in their minds finally, under the leadership of Satan himself, finally wipe out Israel. So I am going to make Jerusalem. In other words, as we read last week in Ezekiel 5, the Jerusalem is the center of the world. And so now we see that it's Jerusalem that's going to be a cup that sends all surrounding peoples reeling, which means that Jerusalem is going to become a major stumbling block for the entire world. And we can see that happening today. We're seeing more and more anxiety over Temple Mount. It's so much going on in terms of a new temple which has to be built, but yet the Muslims claiming that the Jews don't have a right to the temple, and nations trying to tell Israel that East Jerusalem needs to be the capital of a new Palestinian state. I mean, it's just everything that God said was going to happen. He goes on to say, on that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her. This is all the nations of the earth are going to be gathered against Jerusalem at some point in time. That's never happened before. And this is, again, another reference to the battle or war, whatever you want to call it, of Armageddon. So if it's all nations, it has to include whatever might at that time be left of the United States. All the nations, and this is now at the very end of the tribulation, under the leadership of the Antichrist, are going to attempt to move against Israel and wipe out the Jewish people. It goes on to say, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. So what God is saying there is that it's going to become, and I think some translations say, a burdensome stone, that the status of Jerusalem is going to become such a burden that there's not going to be a solution to it. And the world under the Antichrist will think that the solution is this major military offensive against Israel at the very end of the tribulation. It goes on to say, on that day, again, I will strike. And so this is anybody that doesn't think that God will defend Israel. It doesn't mean that they won't go through persecution and difficulties, but he is going to defend them. Why? Because he made a commitment to them. He made a promise to them. He promised to preserve and to protect them. And so it says, on that day, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness, declares the Lord. I will keep a watchful eye over Judah, which is a synonym or another word for Jerusalem, but I will blind all the horses of the nations. So that's a reference to when Jesus Christ physically returns. And we read in Revelation 19, when he does come back, one of the first things he's going to do is to wipe out this giant military confederacy that's going to gather around Israel, which is what is being referred to here. On that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot in a woodpile, like a flaming torch among sheaves. They will consume all the surrounding peoples, right and left, but Jerusalem will remain intact in her place. So, in other words, as much as the world wants to destroy Israel, destroy Jerusalem, God himself is going to protect them.
So, Bob, when all the nations come against Israel, will that be during the tribulation?
Very end of the tribulation. Right. And this is not to be confused with the Ezekiel 38 war. That's a different battle, which probably will happen just before the tribulation. So this is a clear reference to Armageddon. We're now at the end, and we know it's distinct because this is when God himself will come back. Jesus will come back and do this. On that day, the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. On that day, I, God, will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. And, in, I think it's Revelation 16, where it talks about Armageddon, somewhere around there. It talks about the huge valley, the valley of Megiddo, which is Armageddon, where all the nations are going to gather, and the blood being up to the horses' bridles. And it's going to be a bloodbath, and that blood is going to come from the nations that Jesus is going to defeat. And we read in Revelation that when he comes back, he's not going to need anybody's help. He's not going to need an army to help him to do this. He can do it by himself. And so he's going to take care of Israel at the very end. Then it goes on to say, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. So what does that mean? We've talked about Israel being scattered throughout the world, but ultimately coming back into Israel from the four corners of the earth, but coming back what? In unbelief. They come back in unbelief, and at the very end of the tribulation, as is revealed in Romans 11, when all Israel will be saved, that's when the Jewish people, those that are around at that time, will be saved. It goes on to say, I will pour out on the house of David, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, a spirit of grace and supplication. Right? We know exactly when that is. When Jesus comes back. And it goes on to say, this is a message for Israel, for the Jews that are in Jerusalem when Jesus returns. The Jews, will look upon me for the first time, for most of them, the one they have pierced. Remember, this is 700 years BC. So who was pierced? Jesus was pierced. So there's a clear reference to the fact that they are going to, when he comes back, the Jews that are alive and they see what Jesus does for them, those that are there, and it goes on in Romans, as we said, it says that all Israel will be saved. And so they'll look upon me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Jesus Christ was, fulfills that description. And grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day, the weeping in Jerusalem will be as great as the weeping of Hadid Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, each clan by itself, with their wives by themselves. The clan, so it's talking about the destruction and so on and so forth. So this is clearly a reference to the return of Jesus Christ, but what's going to cause it is the status of Jerusalem, the status of Temple Mount that we're seeing unfold right now in a real way. It's becoming more and more tense. And then as we, the next couple of weeks, look at some chapters or some verses in the book of Daniel, it's clear that before Jesus comes back, there's going to be a new temple on Temple Mount. And so it's all going to take place. So it's hard to know how that's going to happen. It's hard to know how a temple's going to, particularly with all the everything that's going on over there right now, but God's going to do something. And the only place that temple can be built is on Temple Mount. It can't be built anywhere else, because according to the Jewish tradition, that's Mount Moriah, which is where Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him. And it's interesting that when he's about to do it, what did God say? He says, God will provide himself a sacrifice. Amazing, if you think about that, just kind of an amazing prophetic message that God uttered when Isaac says, "Where is the lamb or the goat or whatever to be sacrificed?" And God says, He will provide Himself a sacrifice. So, prophecy of what would happen several thousand years later. So we're seeing it happen. We're watching all this stuff unfold. Israel, if we look at Psalm 83, quickly. I know we've talked about this one before too, but I think it's a good reminder of where we are. So here it is, Psalm 83. O God, do not remain silent. Do not turn a deaf ear. Do not stand aloof, O God. See how your enemies growl. Enemies of who? Enemies of God. How your foes rear their heads with cunning. You know, if you think about that word cunning and how Satan uses deceit and deception, these people that are being referred to in Psalm 83 are clearly under the influence of Satan himself, who is using cunning to deceive these people that are being referenced here. They conspire against your people. So it's a prophecy about people conspiring against Israel. They plot those you cherish. Never lose sight of how important the Jewish people are to God. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation so that Israel's name is remembered no more. Probably 900 BC or so. And what does Iran say today? That we're going to wipe them off the face of the map? We're going to annihilate the Jewish people? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. That's exactly what we're seeing unfold today. With one mind, they plot together. They form an alliance against you. So this is a reference to the various nations that surround Israel, of one mind plotting against not Israel, but God. And so when these nations are conspiring against Israel, they're really conspiring against God if you think about it. With one mind, they plot together. So what's this one mind? What is it that the nations that surround Israel have in common? Islam. You know, whether they're Sunnis or, and right now, things are in a state of quiet in terms of some of those nations with the Abrahamic Accord. But even though we see some good things happening there and some very positive things, in the background you see Saudi Arabia, for example, discussing the possibility of developing relations with Israel like some of the others have, while at the same time they're in communications with Iran. So we have all of these nations conspiring. Come, let us destroy them as a nation so that Israel's name is remembered no more. With one mind, they, those nations around them, plot together. They form an alliance against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagrites. So Edom is a reference to the area of what we today would call Jordan. The Ishmaelites are the Arabian Peninsula, where Ishmael and his descendants ultimately settled. Moab also, Jordan. Hagrites, Egypt. Ammon, Amalek, Egypt. Philistia, which is Gaza. Tyre, which is Lebanon. East of Syria has joined them to reinforce Lot's descendants. So what we have here is a clear picture. We don't call them, in the Bible, we don't call them Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, Gaza Strip, and so forth. They were referred to by this name. So these nations that are referred to here are the same ones that are surrounding Israel today, most of which, at least as far as right now is concerned, are committed to Israel's destruction. Do to them as you did to Midian, as you did to Sisera and Jabin at the river Kishon, who perished at Endor and became like dung on the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and their princesses like Zeba and Zalmunna, who said, let us take possession of the pasture lands of God. I mean, is that happening today? Are they desirous of taking Israel's land, what little bit they have left? Of course they are. Make them like tumbleweed, my God. In other words, the writer of this psalm is asking God to deal with these enemies of Israel. As fire consumes the forest or flame sets the mountains ablaze, pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your storm. Cover their faces with shame and so forth. So, verse 18, let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, Yahweh, that you alone are the most high over all the earth. And so we have this Psalm 83 prophecy. Now, Amir feels, and I don't disagree with him, he feels that prophecy was fulfilled in 1948. Right after Israel became a nation, they were attacked. Virtually the day after they became a nation, they were attacked by 5 Arab armies that came together with the purpose of wiping, of forcing Israel out of the land. And of course, Israel won that. So that well could have been the fulfillment of this. There's another fellow that's pretty well known. His name is Bill Salus. Today, he feels that this prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. And I don't know. We don't know if it has been or not, but I know that there's a lot of talk about Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, Tyre, Hamas, which is Gaza, Jordan, kind of non-committal, to say nothing. And right now, that whole Arabian Peninsula seems to be pretty calm, but you can be sure that things are going to heat up there again. So a lot going on there. So Israel, Jerusalem, key player in everything that's going on. So with that, I want to go back to our study, if we could. And we spent a lot of time reviewing the Abrahamic Covenant, the covenant that God created with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, that he would create from them a great nation, etc., that he would bless those that blessed them, that he would curse those that cursed them, and that from them would them all peoples through Jesus Christ would be blessed. So back into, if you have the notes entitled More Israel, just a couple of things I want to go over pretty quickly, because in addition to the Abrahamic Covenant, which as we saw was unilateral, unconditional, and everlasting. And that covenant is still in play today. It still applies because it's an everlasting covenant. And we can see clear evidence in the world today that it still applies. But in addition to that, God created with Israel a bilateral contract or a bilateral covenant known as the law, known as the Mosaic Covenant. And it starts in Exodus, where the 10 Commandments are laid out. And we all know what those are, that it started out with the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, and the various 10 Commandments, to which were added some 600 other commands and decrees that God said that Israel must obey. And so that was the covenant that basically said that if you obey my commands, if you obey my decrees, I will bless you. But if you don't, I will curse you. So that covenant, unlike the Abrahamic covenant, required obedience. And of course, God knew that they would not be able to obey the provisions of the law. So let's just take a look at a couple of scriptures. And before we go on, Exodus 3, 6, and 15, if you want to take a look at this later, just as confirmation of what we've been talking about. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Israel, what? Forever. Clearly articulated. That's not going to change. So Israel, just a couple of points that I think we've touched on, but just as a reminder, their very existence is inexplicable. How do you explain the fact that they were scattered for 4,000 or 2,000 years or 2,600 years, depending on when the diaspora actually began, but yet still identifiable and still coming back to Israel exactly as God said? So their very existence, and we've talked about that, really is not something that we can comprehend. Unlike other people who assimilated within the groups they were sent to, Israel never did. They, for the most part, did not intermarry and retain their identity and their heritage, and God certainly knows who they are and has preserved them through all these centuries. They're despised, and they're despised because they're God's chosen people. They're despised because Satan knows that the coming tribulation is about Israel. It's you go through the Revelation and you see a reference to the 144,000 Jewish evangelists in the temple and the two witnesses and the abomination of desolation and Satan being cast out of heaven and going after Israel with an absolute vengeance. It's really all about Israel. Granted, there are going to be Gentiles during the tribulation that are going to be required if they don't, going into the tribulation. Well, they won't go into the tribulation if they know Christ, but it's really about Israel. And so Satan's behind anti-Semitism. He tried to destroy Jesus when he was very young. Remember the edict that Herod sent out to kill all the kids or all the boys, 2 years and younger, with the idea that he was going to kill Jesus. That was satanic. And knowing that he needed to prevent what? He needed to prevent the crucifixion, because that's really where Satan was defeated. He was defeated at the cross. When Jesus laid his life down and paid the ultimate price, that was it for Satan. But sadly, Satan does not believe or still apparently feels that he can still win the battle, which is why we're seeing the anti-Semitism and why we're going to see these incredible attacks against Israel. When we hear things like the United Nations, the 119 votes to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, that's satanically inspired.
I think that was unanimous vote, wasn't it?
Pardon me?
I think that was unanimous vote, too.
No, it wasn't. It was 119 to 30 some, I think. Yeah, with I think 16 abstentions. But still, the majority of countries voted in favor of that. So it's all satanic, and it's only going to get worse for Israel. Messiah, Jesus, had to come through the lineage or through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then down through David and so on and so forth. So Satan knew that that was going to take place. The most hated people in country in history, throughout history, nations and empires have been doing everything they can to try to wipe them out. And I think, as we've said before, I believe that one thing that the United States has, or at least has had, going forward is its support of Israel. We're really the only nation, a few others here and there, but the only nation, major empire in history that has truly supported Israel. And now we're beginning to turn. This new administration is anything but pro-Israel. And so with that, we go back to God's commitment to curse those that curse them.
You mentioned in the past about just before the big hurricane in New Orleans, the U.S. tried to broker some kind of a deal with Israel. I remember you mentioned this before. and it was right before the big hurricane.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you knew this because I just saw a blurb on Fox 61 the day before these big tornadoes. The Biden administration is proposing 3 sanctions against Israel.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
The
Yes.
day before.
Right. Right.
Is
Yeah.
that on 61?
Fox 61.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just say.
Just saying.
Just saying.
I had a tornado that was on the ground for 200 and something miles. That's
Yeah.
unheard of.
Never seen anything. We've never seen anything like. It's interesting. If you want to read a book, it goes back a few years. The title of the book is "Eye to Eye," written by a guy by the name of Bill Koenig, I think is his pronoun. Eye to Eye. Yeah, and I haven't read it myself. I've listened to him and get his newsletter every week, but he's written a book. That's the title of it. And he was a part of the Washington press corps for a long time. He's no longer with this new administration, but he's given his book to people like Mike Pence and others. They all know about it. But what he does in this book is he points out, I think, something like 200 different major events, catastrophes that have occurred right after we've taken an anti-Israel position. And I think the one is, if you go back to Hurricane Katrina, which was just a massive, massive hurricane. The day before that hit was, I believe, the day that the Jews were pulled out of Gaza. That Ariel Sharon and under the influence of then President Bush demanded that every Jew living in Gaza be removed. And it was the next day that Katrina hit. There's tons of examples like that. I'm not particularly dogmatic about things like that, but it's worth noting and thinking about. So, and this guy, he's not some fly-by-night. He knows what he's talking about.
What's
So,
his last name?
huh?
Koenig. I just ordered it from him.
Yeah.
$20.
If somebody wants to read it,
4.5 star rating.
if somebody wants to read the book and report back, I don't really have time to read it, but
Book report.
yeah, book. You taking the assignment, John?
Yeah, I don't care.
Okay.
You know how many unread books
All right.
I have? Just wait till
Another fact that we may not be aware of is that many mainline churches in the United States, throughout the world, are also anti-Semitic. And when I say mainline churches, the United Church of Christ, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, many of the World Council of Churches and so forth, are all supporters of what they call boycott, divestiture, and sanctions, which is a program where they will not take any support or support any companies that do business with anybody in Israel. And so this is, and like the Presbyterians have come right out, the Episcopalians have come right out and attacked Israel, at least on paper. So something to think about. So we have the Mosaic Covenant, the law. The law was never, as I've said in the notes here, called eternal like the Abrahamic Covenant. So we keep the two separate. It was conditional. It was bilateral. And Israel was required to obey God's commands and decrees. Let's take a quick look at Leviticus chapter 26. And I'm just going to skim some of it here. But here's kind of an outline. And this is Moses who's writing this under the inspiration of God. And it reads in 26, it says, quote, "Do not make idols," speaking to the Jewish people, "or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God." And that gets to the, you shall not have any false gods before me. "Observe my Sabbaths and have reference for my sanctuary. I am the Lord." His sanctuary being the tabernacle and then ultimately the temple. "If," you don't see the word "if" when it relates to the the Abrahamic covenants. We're not talking about this bilateral covenant referred to as the law. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land, if they obey. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall by the sword before you. So in other words, if they obey, then God will be with them and protect them and cause them to prosper. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall by the sword before you. I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. That's my part of this agreement. I will bless you if you obey me. You will still be eating last year's harvest when you have to move it out to make room for the new. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. So God says, I am going to dwell among the Israelites. I will be there personally. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. But we go into verse 14. If you do not listen and carry out these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws, and fail to carry out all my commands, and so violate my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring on you sudden terror, wasting diseases, fever that will destroy your sight and sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. And then go down to verse 23, because he lists more things that he'll do to them if they don't obey his commands. Verse 23, if in spite of these things you do not accept my correction, but continue to be hostile toward me, I myself will be hostile toward you and will afflict you for your sins 7 times over. And that's what happened later on when remember the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, and the Israelites, Daniel and so forth, were taken captive into Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. The prophet Jeremiah said that captivity would last 70 years, which is what God said here. It would be 1 year for every 7 in captivity that they failed to let the land lie. One of the things they had to do was every 7 years allow the land that they had planted to lie fallow. The Jews did not do it for a period of 490 years, so God, in fulfillment of this, sent them into captivity for a period of 7 years into Babylon. And that's why later on Daniel knew when that 70-year period was going to come to an end and the Jews would be allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Verse 31, I will turn your cities into ruins and lay waste your sanctuary. I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. I will lay waste to the land so that your enemies will live there and be appalled. I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste and your cities lie in ruins. This is 4,000 years ago. And at this point, it's not a prophecy. I would call it more a warning. If you don't obey my commands, I'm going to scatter your descendants throughout the world. And guess what? They didn't. As we read in 1 Kings and Ezekiel, they literally got to the point where they became so engrossed in the pagan practices of their surrounding nations, they literally engaged in child sacrifices. That's how far away from God the Jewish people became. But then look in verse 40. If they will, this is after scattering them, which they did, their land laid waste. We've talked about Mark Twain, who in the 1800s wrote a book, and said he's never seen such a desolate land. It's desolate from border to border. It's exactly what happened, that the land laid waste and cities would lie in ruins. But then in verse 40, if they confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness and their hostility toward me, which made me hostile toward them, so that I sent them into the land of their enemies. That's happened. They're coming back still today in fulfillment of this. Then, when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they pay the price for their sin, here we go. I will remember my covenant, this is now he's remembering his everlasting covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land will be deserted by them and will enjoy its Sabbath while it lies desolate. They will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord their God. So while he has this bilateral covenant, you must obey, and you must obey my commands and decrees. If you don't, I'm going to punish you. But over that is the Abrahamic Covenant, which is unconditional. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? We're talking about two different covenants, one that's unconditional, but yet one during that period of unconditional covenant, God is testing his people. So let's just quickly, and I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of stuff, and because we're really getting behind. I want to just quickly go to the book of Jeremiah chapter 31, because what the Israelites proved was that we're all sinners. That's the purpose of the law, quite frankly. We read that in Romans, and we'll get into a couple of those verses the next time, but I want to just leave on this particular note, is that they disobeyed God. He punished them. He scattered them. He caused them to be persecuted. The land was laid waste. And what they did, what God also did, was to implement this sacrificial system, which is what the temple was all about. The temple is where the Israelites would go to atone for their sins. They would sacrifice sheep and goats and grain offerings and so forth. But it was a continual thing. None of those could permanently atone for sin. But they did go through the rituals, and over several hundred years, a couple of thousand years, quite frankly, God got tired of their sacrifices because they were just doing them by rote. They didn't mean anything. They were sacrificing blemished animals and so forth. And so what we read here, and this is an extension of what I'm going to read here in chapter 31, is an extension of the Abrahamic Covenant. We're now at the point where God says, I'm fed up with their sacrifices. And Malachi says, I would just as soon lock the temple doors. It's a waste of time. It's a waste. They're not devoted, and these are not sincere offerings that they're making to me. But he goes on to say in chapter 31 of Jeremiah, chapter 30, I'm sorry, we're going to go to chapter 31, verse 31 of chapter 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. So God says, I'm going to issue a new covenant. And what we're going to see in just a moment is that this new covenant is an extension or part of the Abrahamic covenant, where he promised that all peoples, Jews and Gentiles alike, would be blessed through a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The days are coming. So when this prophecy is written, it's still in the future. When I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. Remember that. He's making this covenant with Israel, not with the Gentiles and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors, referring to the origins of the law, the Ten Commandments and so forth, when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel. Again, after that time, at some point in the future, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and will write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. This is a reference to when Jesus comes back. So now we've gone from the Abrahamic Covenant to the law to the offerings that they were making that were really of no value, to now God said, I'm going to make a new covenant, and then at some point in time, because of this new covenant I am going to make with Israel, Israel, will put the law in their minds, write it on their hearts. That's a spiritual awakening. So something's going to have to happen in order for the Jews to recognize Jesus Christ. That's what this is all about. I will be their God. He's not yet their God. Jesus, for the most part, is not Israel's God, but it says he will be. Another prophecy. And Israel, will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least to the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. So a prophecy about something that was going to happen. He's going to create a new covenant. Turn to Luke, and we'll finish with this. Luke chapter 22. And we'll finish with this. Remember, he said he's going to make a new covenant with who? With Israel. Let's look at verse 19. This is the Last Supper, and we'll finish with this. This is very familiar to all of us as we get toward, when we get to Resurrection Sunday and so forth. I'll start in verse 17. After taking the cup, he gave thanks, and he says, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So when we go to heaven and we and everybody are with him, there's going to be a wedding feast where he is going to, for the first time since then, partake of the wine again. He took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, what? This cup is the new covenant. Remember, 700 years ago, he promised he was going to make a new covenant with the Jewish people. And now Jesus is sitting here and saying, I am the new covenant. This is the cup. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. So in other words, my shed blood, my death that's going to take place on the cross, my blood which is poured out for you, will fulfill God's promise for the new covenant. And so what we have here is all this stuff with the law and the atonement and the sacrifices and so on and so forth really are all about leading to the ultimate fulfillment of the new covenant. That has taken place. We know that that Jesus is the new covenant. And it's in fulfillment, and that's an important thing to remember, particularly for those of us Gentiles, and I think we all are in this room, that are blessed because of this, that guess what? If there were no Jews, there'd been no new covenant. And he laid his life down, as we read in Jeremiah, for the Jewish people. The covenant was for Israel. Now, in his grace and mercy, as we read in Romans, got like 1 minute here. In Romans chapter 11. Oh, how did the Gentiles fit into all of this? Great question he answered. Romans 11:11. And we read in Romans 11:11, again I ask, did they stumble so far as to fall beyond recovery? So Paul here is writing about the Israelites, the Jews who are now in a state of blindness because they did not recognize their Messiah. But that covenant is still in effect. Did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? This is a great verse for replacement theology advocates. He goes on to say, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But in their transgression, if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion come? I am talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry. And then if we go down to verse 25. I do not want you, he's writing to the church here, to believers, do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery. So that when you see the word mystery in the New Testament, it's the first time something's revealed. Brothers and sisters, so he's writing to fellow Christians, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved as it is written. So if we go back up, we see that we Gentiles are grafted in. If you go back to verse 14, we'll go to 15. For if their rejection, speaking of Israel, brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life in the end? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root, so if some of the branches, and I'm actually jumping ahead here a little bit, but earlier, and we'll read it because I know we're running real late, but what he's saying here is that if we read in verse 24, verse 22, verse 23, if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So in other words, what is stated here, and I'm rambling a bit, is that we are, God is using the metaphor or the example of an olive tree, not a natural olive tree, a cultivated olive tree that has natural branches coming off. One of those natural branches, which represents Israel, is broken off, and then the wild branch, which you really can't do, but the wild branch is grafted in. That wild branch are Gentiles, which is the church. So we're grafted in to a relationship with Jesus Christ that was originally established for Israel. So we're grafted into those promises. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to be very thankful that the Jewish people are there. The devil is after them, and things are only going to get worse for them in the days, months, weeks to come. But without Israel, and that's why we should, I believe Christians should support Israel. But for Israel, there would be no church. It's that simple. So, I kind of got off course a little bit, but questions, comments, ideas, thoughts that make sense? All right. But I think it's fascinating to see the way God just has everything laid out. He established the law. He knew that they weren't going to be able to obey the law. And at the end of the day, he said, okay, well, these sacrifices, like they were, for example, for Passover, they were required to take a 14-day-old lamb, unblemished, no blemishes whatsoever, and sacrifice it. And that sacrifice, the shed blood of the lamb, is a precursor, a foreshadowing of the shed blood of the Lamb of God. So when you see the Passover, the perfect lamb, unblemished lamb being sacrificed, it's a foreshadowing of, as John revealed, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So we see this foreshadowing throughout the Old Testament that was fulfilled through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, which is really, I mean, obviously, the gospel, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ is the center and the main part of everything we're studying. Everything points to that, and everything emanates from that.
The replacement theology, that verse right there shoots that totally out of the water.
Yeah.
Clearly. I
Right.
mean, it makes... So where are they pulling it from if they're not taking the whole book into consideration?
I think they're just blinded to the truth for whatever reason. I don't know. They have a couple of scriptures that, and I'm not sure which ones, but that they have to rely upon and twist and distort. It's like if you read the Bible literally, you can't possibly come to a replacement theology point of view. Just like a rapture. The rapture, if you read the Bible literally and you don't allegorize or spiritualize or try to make things say something other than what they say, if you just take them literally, you have to come away with a pre-tribulation view of the rapture, that God is not finished with Israel, that there is going to be a millennial kingdom, that there's going to be a tribulation. But what happens is that some of these that have these different views, they take these scriptures and they tend to twist them. They'll take a word and they'll change them, or they'll mean something else. But just read it literally. It's kind of a rule of studying the Bible. If the plain sense makes common sense, take it no further. But if you have those that allegorize or spiritualize the scripture, then it just becomes putty in their hand. And if they can change something like God's relationship with Israel, why couldn't they change salvation or the death and anything else in the Bible?